When people look at Waddesdon Manor, they see beauty, elegance, and refinement. They see a fairy tale mansion, rising from the English countryside, inspired by French Renaissance palaces, filled with priceless art, rare wines, and glittering chandeliers. But Waddesdon Manor is more than a beautiful house. It is a monument to power, quiet power. The kind that does not wear a crown, yet often stands closer to the throne than kings themselves. Waddesdon Manor was built in the 1870s by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, a member of the most powerful banking family in Europe. The Rothschilds were not royalty, but they financed royalty. They did not rule nations, but they funded wars, stabilized governments, and advised emperors. In an age when kings depended on money to survive, the family that controlled money held influence that titles alone could not provide. The manor was never meant to be a family home in the ordinary sense. It was a stage. Every dinner, every artwork, every imported stone was carefully chosen to impress Britain's elite. Royals, politicians, and aristocrats were frequent guests. These gatherings were not only social, they were strategic. Decisions that shaped empires were often discussed over wine and candlelight. Far from parliament or public scrutiny, outside the gates of Waddesdon, Victorian Britain was struggling. Industrial workers lived in crowded slums. Children labored in factories. Hunger and disease were common. Yet inside the manor, wealth flowed without restraint. This contrast is part of the dark story. Waddesdon represents a world where privilege was inherited, protected, and displayed, while millions had no voice at all. The Rothschilds' success also made them targets of suspicion. As a Jewish family rising to extraordinary wealth in Christian Europe, they faced prejudice and rumors. Some of these stories were exaggerated or false, but they grew from a real fear that unelected financiers had more influence than elected leaders. Waddesdon Manor became a symbol of that fear, a place where wealth seemed untouchable, hidden behind art and tradition. Even the name, Old Money, carries weight here. Old money does not shout. It whispers. It builds beauty, sponsors culture, and presents itself as refined and generous, while quietly preserving its dominance. Waddesdon Manor was donated to the nation in the 20th century, framed as an act of generosity. Yet it also ensured the Rothschild legacy would be admired rather than questioned. Today, visitors walk through its halls as tourists. They admire the gardens, the paintings, the architecture. But few are encouraged to think about how such wealth was accumulated, who benefited from it, and who was left outside the gates. Waddesdon Manor stands as a reminder that history is not only written by kings and queens, but also by those who financed their power, and did so without ever needing a crown. Waddesdon Manor was never intended to be merely a residence. From its conception in the late 19th century, it was designed as a statement, one carefully calculated to announce arrival, legitimacy, and permanence within Britain's rigid hierarchy of power. When Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild began construction in 1874, he was not simply building a home in Buckinghamshire. He was constructing a visible symbol of old money. Authority. Crafted to rival the historic estates of Britain's oldest noble families, and to secure the Rothschild name within the social orbit of royalty itself. To understand the significance of Waddesdon Manor, one must first understand Victorian Britain's obsession with lineage. The British aristocracy valued ancestry almost more than wealth. Titles, land ownership, and centuries Old bloodlines formed the backbone of social legitimacy. New wealth, especially wealth generated through finance rather than land, was often viewed with suspicion. The Rothschilds possessed immense fortune, but money alone did not grant automatic acceptance into the uppermost ranks of British society. Waddesdon Manor was, in many ways, an architectural argument, a claim that the Rothschilds belonged among Europe's ruling elite. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild was a product of two worlds. He inherited the financial empire established by his grandfather, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, whose banking network had spread across Europe through his 5 sons. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschilds had financed governments, underwritten wars, and advised monarchs from Vienna to Paris. Yet Ferdinand also understood that Britain's elite valued culture, taste, and tradition as much as capital. Waddesdon Manor was therefore designed not as an English country house, but as a French Renaissance château. A deliberate choice, meant to associate the Rothschild name with the grandeur of European royal courts. The manor's design was inspired by the châteaux of the Loire Valley, estates traditionally associated with French kings and high nobility. This was not accidental. French court culture represented refinement, intellect, and historical prestige. By importing this style into the English countryside, Ferdinand was symbolically importing royal legitimacy. The message was clear. The Rothschilds were not provincial bankers. They were heirs to a continental aristocratic tradition that predated many British titles. Every detail of Waddesdon reinforced this message. The art collection rivaled that of royal palaces, including rare works from the Renaissance and Baroque periods. The gardens were meticulously planned to evoke the controlled elegance associated with aristocratic estates. Even the placement of the manor on a hill served a symbolic purpose: visibility. Like medieval castles or royal palaces, Waddesdon was meant to be seen, dominating the surrounding landscape as a physical manifestation of authority. Yet Waddesdon's true power lay not in its walls, but in its function as a social and political space. Ferdinand de Rothschild hosted elaborate weekend gatherings attended by members of the British royal family, high-ranking politicians, and influential aristocrats. These events were carefully curated. Seating arrangements, conversation topics, and guest lists were planned with precision. In Victorian society, access mattered as much as titles. Waddesdon provided access. Queen Victoria herself never visited the manor, but her son, the future King Edward I, was a frequent guest. Edward was known for his love of luxury, fine art, and elite company. His presence at Waddesdon was not merely social, it was symbolic. Royal association validated the Rothschilds' position within Britain's power structure. In turn, the Rothschilds provided a setting that reflected the refinement and wealth expected by royalty. This relationship illustrates how old money, power truly functioned. Unlike new industrial wealth, which was often loud and disruptive, old money operated quietly through patronage, hospitality, and cultural dominance. Waddesdon Manor became a neutral ground where royalty and finance intersected. No laws were passed there, no treaties signed, yet influence flowed freely. Conversations held over dinner could shape alliances, soften opposition, or build trust between those who controlled money and those who wore crowns. The very existence of Waddesdon challenged traditional ideas of power. The British aristocracy derived its authority from land and inherited titles. The Rothschilds derived theirs from financial networks that transcended borders. By building an estate that mirrored aristocratic grandeur, Ferdinand blurred the distinction between hereditary rule and financial dominance. Waddesdon suggested that power in the modern age did not need a crown, it needed permanence, culture, and proximity to royalty. However, this quiet assertion of power also exposed the tensions of Victorian society. Britain was undergoing rapid industrialization. While the elite gathered at estates like Waddesdon, factory workers labored in dangerous conditions, and urban poverty grew more severe. The contrast between Waddesdon's opulence and the realities of working class life highlighted the widening gap between those who benefited from global finance and those who bore the cost of empire and industry. Critically, Waddesdon Manor also functioned as a tool of assimilation. Despite their wealth, the Rothschilds remained outsiders in certain respects, most notably due to their Jewish identity in a largely Christian aristocratic society. By embracing European high culture, collecting royal art, and hosting Britain's elite, the Rothschilds were asserting cultural belonging. Waddesdon was proof that they could master the language of aristocracy as fluently as they mastered finance. Over time, the manor helped transform public perception of the family. Rather than being viewed solely as bankers, the Rothschilds came to be seen as patrons of art, culture, and national heritage. This shift was crucial. Old money maintains its power not by hoarding wealth alone, but by shaping narratives. Waddesdon told a story of refinement, generosity, and continuity, qualities traditionally associated with royalty. When Waddesdon was eventually passed into the care of the National Trust, it was framed as an act of public generosity. Yet this too reflected old money strategy. By donating the estate, the Rothschilds ensured their legacy would be preserved as part of Britain's national story, rather than questioned as a symbol of inequality. Waddesdon became history, not controversy. In the end, Waddesdon Manor stands as more than a mansion. It is a physical record of how wealth adapts to power structures, rather than confronting them directly. Ferdinand de Rothschild did not challenge the monarchy. He aligned with it. He did not reject aristocratic values. He mastered them. Through architecture, art, and social access, Waddesdon Manor secured the Rothschilds a place among Europe's elite without ever needing a royal title. This is the true meaning of old money power. It does not demand authority, it assumes it. Waddesdon Manor remains a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who inherit crowns, but by those who build the spaces where crowns feel at home. Throughout European history, power has rarely been exercised by monarchs alone. Kings and queens ruled in name, but their authority was often constrained by the realities of finance. Armies needed to be paid, palaces maintained, colonies administered, and wars sustained over years rather than weeks. By the 19th century, the ability to govern increasingly depended not on lineage alone, but on access to capital. It was within this space, between the crown and the treasury, that families like the Rothschilds gained extraordinary influence. The Rothschild banking dynasty did not emerge through accident or intrigue, but through structural necessity. As European states expanded, their financial needs outgrew traditional systems of taxation and royal treasuries. Monarchs who once relied on feudal obligations now faced industrial warfare, global trade, and national debt. Banking families filled this gap. They lent money to governments not as rulers, but as indispensable partners. This relationship fundamentally altered how power functioned across Europe. Unlike medieval financiers, the Rothschilds operated internationally. By establishing banking houses in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, the family created a financial network that transcended borders. This was revolutionary. European monarchies were confined by territory, but capital could move freely. A Rothschild loan raised in London could fund an Austrian army or stabilize a French regime. This flexibility gave the family leverage, not political authority, but strategic indispensability. Crucially, the Rothschilds did not seek thrones or titles of rule. Their power lay in proximity, not sovereignty. They advised kings, negotiated terms, and facilitated payments, but they avoided direct governance. This restraint was deliberate. In an age of revolution, monarchs fell quickly, but financiers who remained neutral survived. By positioning themselves as servants of the state rather than challengers to it, the Rothschilds ensured longevity. Royal courts understood this dynamic well. Britain, in particular, relied heavily on financial expertise during the Napoleonic Wars. The British government's ability to fund coalitions against France depended on complex international transfers of gold and credit. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, operating from London, played a key role in facilitating these flows. He did not command armies, but his logistical efficiency directly affected Britain's military capability. This reality blurred the line between financial service and political influence. Yet influence did not mean control. Monarchs were not puppets, nor were bankers omnipotent. The relationship was transactional, shaped by mutual dependence. Kings needed money. Bankers needed stability. This balance created a subtle form of power, one exercised through negotiation rather than decree. The Rothschilds could not force a king's hand, but they could shape the conditions under which decisions were made. In Britain, this relationship was particularly nuanced. The monarchy operated within a constitutional framework, where Parliament held financial authority. Even so, access to credit remained essential. The Rothschilds became trusted intermediaries between government institutions and international markets. Their discretion and reliability earned them a reputation that money alone could not buy. Trust became their greatest asset. Social integration reinforced this trust. Banking families cultivated relationships with royalty through shared culture rather than overt politics. They sponsored art, hosted gatherings, and supported national causes. Estates like Waddesdon Manor were not centers of political command, but environments where familiarity replaced suspicion. When royals dined at Rothschild tables, barriers dissolved. Influence flowed not through orders, but through conversation. This form of power was invisible to the public but deeply felt within elite circles. Unlike ministers, financiers were not accountable to voters. Unlike nobles, they were not bound by feudal obligations. Their authority rested on competence and discretion. In many ways, this made them more resilient than royalty itself. When regimes changed, bankers adapted. European history offers clear examples. After the fall of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna reshaped the continent. Monarchs negotiated borders and titles, but the reconstruction of Europe required capital. The Rothschilds played a central role in financing post-war stability. Their involvement was pragmatic rather than ideological. They funded conservative monarchies and constitutional governments alike. demonstrating loyalty not to ideology, but to continuity. This neutrality earned them access across political divides. While kings were constrained by alliances and rivalries, financiers could operate across enemy lines. This ability made them valuable, and occasionally resented. Critics accused banking families of lacking patriotism, but such accusations misunderstood the nature of their role. Their survival depended on political moderation and long-term thinking, not nationalistic fervor. Royal suspicion occasionally surfaced, particularly during times of unrest. In moments of crisis, unelected influence became a convenient target. Yet monarchs rarely severed ties with financiers, because doing so risked financial collapse. The relationship endured because it was functional. Power in the modern age required expertise as much as authority. By the late 19th century, this financial influence became institutionalized. Governments issued bonds, managed debt, and relied on international markets. The personal relationships between monarchs and bankers gradually shifted toward formal systems. Yet the legacy of proximity remained. Families like the Rothschilds were woven into the fabric of governance, not as rulers, but as stabilizers. Importantly, this form of influence reshaped the meaning of sovereignty. Monarchs retained symbolic authority, but economic realities constrained their choices. Wars could not be fought without loans. Infrastructure could not be built without investment. In this sense, financial power acted as a silent partner to political rule. It did not replace the crown, it limited and supported it simultaneously. The Rothschilds understood this balance and protected it carefully. They avoided public office, declined overt political roles, and maintained an image of service rather than dominance. This strategy preserved their access across generations. While dynasties fell, the family's influence persisted. In royal history, this marks a turning point. Power ceased to be solely hereditary. It became collaborative. Monarchs ruled, but they no longer ruled alone. Banking families provided the means by which rule was possible. Estates like Waddesdon Manor symbolized this shift. Spaces where crowns and capital met as equals, each dependent on the other. Thus, the influence of banking families over royalty was not a hidden conspiracy, but an open consequence of modern governance. It reflected the transformation of Europe from feudal kingdoms to financial states. The Rothschilds did not overthrow monarchies. They helped them survive an age that demanded resources beyond royal treasuries. In this quiet partnership between money and monarchy lies the true story of power in 19th century Europe, a story not of control, but of dependence, negotiation, and the rise of influence without a crown. By the time Waddesdon Manor rose above the Buckinghamshire countryside, Britain was the wealthiest empire in the world, and one of the most unequal. The Victorian era was marked by astonishing contrasts. Industrial progress and imperial expansion generated unprecedented riches for the upper classes, while millions of workers lived in conditions that had changed little from the medieval past. Waddesdon Manor, with its imported stone, priceless art, and elaborate entertainments, existed alongside this reality, not as an exception, but as its most refined expression. The wealth that funded estates like Waddesdon did not emerge in isolation. It was tied to industrialization, global trade, colonial extraction, and finance. While aristocrats and financiers enjoyed the fruits of empire, the labor that sustained Britain's economy was carried out by factory workers, miners, agricultural laborers, and domestic servants. The social distance between these groups was vast, and it was carefully maintained. Victorian society was structured around hierarchy. At the top sat the monarchy, followed by the hereditary aristocracy, then the gentry, and finally the working poor. Social mobility existed in theory, but in practice it was limited. Wealth alone did not guarantee respectability. Manners, education, and lineage mattered deeply. For families like the Rothschilds, whose wealth came from banking rather than land, estates such as Waddesdon served to bridge this divide. For the working classes, such spaces were unreachable. Life for industrial workers in Victorian Britain was harsh. In rapidly growing cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and long working hours defined daily existence. Factory laborers often worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Child labor was common. Accidents were frequent and compensation rare. Wages barely covered food, leaving little room for comfort or security. Rural poverty was equally severe. Agricultural laborers earned low wages and lived in tied cottages owned by landlords. Their livelihoods depended entirely on landowners who rarely lived among them. When poor harvests or economic downturns occurred, hunger followed. The poor law system, designed to offer relief, often forced the desperate into workhouses where conditions were intentionally grim. Against this backdrop, the lifestyle displayed at Waddesdon Manor was extraordinary. The manor employed dozens of servants, cooks, maids, footmen, gardeners, and chauffeurs, many of whom lived on the estate, but experienced a world far removed from that of their employers. While servants were closer to wealth than factory workers, their lives were governed by strict rules, long hours, and rigid hierarchy. Even within the manor, inequality was carefully structured. Entertainment at Waddesdon reflected elite values. Lavish dinners featured imported wines, rare foods, and multiple courses prepared by trained chefs. Guests arrived for weekend stays that included hunting, music, and art appreciation. Such gatherings reinforced social bonds among the ruling classes. Meanwhile, outside the estate gates, many families struggled to afford bread and coal. This contrast was not accidental. It was foundational to Victorian society. The elite viewed their wealth as a product of hard work, intelligence, and tradition. Poverty, by contrast, was often framed as a moral failing. This belief justified inequality and eased conscience. Philanthropy existed, but it was selective and paternalistic. Charity reinforced hierarchy rather than dismantling it. Royal culture reinforced these divisions. Queen Victoria herself embodied the moral seriousness of the era, yet her reign coincided with extreme wealth concentration. The monarchy symbolized national unity, but it also validated the social order. Royal patronage of aristocratic families and elite institutions affirmed their status. When members of the royal family attended gatherings at estates like Waddesdon, it signaled approval. Industrial wealth and financial capital transformed the countryside as well. Grand estates expanded while small farms declined. Land became a marker of prestige rather than production. Waddesdon's gardens, meticulously designed and maintained, contrasted sharply with the overcrowded urban neighborhoods where greenery was scarce. Nature itself became a luxury. Public awareness of inequality grew during this period. Writers like Charles Dickens exposed the suffering of the poor, while social reformers pushed for labor laws and education. Yet structural change was slow. The political system favored property owners. Many working men lacked the vote until late in the century. Power remained concentrated in the hands of those who owned land and capital. For elites, estates served not only as homes, but as symbols of stability in a rapidly changing world. Industrialization disrupted traditional life, but places like Waddesdon suggested continuity and control. They reassured the ruling classes that despite unrest and reform, hierarchy endured. The presence of immense wealth also fueled resentment. While most criticism targeted industrialists and factory owners, financiers were not exempt. Banking families, perceived as benefiting from economic systems that exploited labor, became symbols of abstract power. Unlike factory owners, they were distant from production, making their wealth seem mysterious and unearned to many observers. Yet it is important to note that Victorian elites did not universally ignore poverty. Many supported reforms, funded hospitals, and improved housing. However, these efforts operated within a framework that preserved inequality. The goal was to manage poverty, not eliminate it. Estates like Waddesdon remained untouched by reform. For the working classes, the manor represented an unreachable world. Its gates marked a physical and symbolic boundary. Few laborers would ever see its interior, let alone participate in its rituals. This separation reinforced the idea that society was divided into distinct spheres, each with its own expectations and limits. By the end of the 19th century, the contrast between wealth and poverty became increasingly difficult to justify. Labor movements gained strength, and demands for reform grew louder. Yet the legacy of Victorian inequality endured. Estates like Waddesdon survived into the modern era, preserved as heritage sites, rather than questioned as products of imbalance. Waddesdon Manor thus stands as a historical document. It records not only artistic taste and elite culture, but also the conditions that made such luxury possible. It reflects a society where prosperity and deprivation coexisted, linked by invisible threads of labor and capital. Understanding this contrast is essential to understanding Victorian Britain itself. In this sense, the manor is not merely a beautiful relic of the past. It is a reminder that the grandeur of empire rested on uneven foundations, and that behind every chandelier and banquet table stood a world of workers whose lives were defined by struggle rather than splendor. Waddesdon Manor endures today as a place of beauty, culture, and national heritage, admired by visitors who walk its halls in quiet awe. Yet its deeper significance lies not only in what it displays, but in what it represents. It stands as a silent witness to an era when power was reshaped, not seized by force, but accumulated through access, wealth, and proximity to the crown. The manor reminds us that history is not made solely in palaces or parliaments, but also in drawing rooms where influence moved without ceremony. The story behind Waddesdon is not one of villains or secret rulers, but of a changing world. It reflects the moment when financial strength began to rival hereditary authority, when old titles learned to coexist with new forms of power, and when luxury was preserved, even as hardship surrounded it. The Rothschilds did not overthrow royal systems. They adapted to them, supported them, and, in doing so, secured a lasting place within them. To understand Waddesdon Manor is to understand how inequality was normalized, how privilege became tradition, and how elegance could soften the harsh realities beneath it. It challenges us to look beyond appearances and ask whose labor, whose silence and whose exclusion made such grandeur possible. In the end, Waddesdon Manor is not just a monument to wealth. It is a mirror held up to history, reflecting a world where power rarely announced itself, where influence wore refinement instead of a crown, and where the legacy of old money was written not in laws, but in stone art, an access that still shape how we remember the past.